Judith Harrison took a sip of her morning coffee and gazed out the living room window. It had been 6 months since they moved to this quiet suburban neighborhood, and while she was still getting used to some aspects, it was an ideal environment for raising Harper. Before giving birth, Judith had built a 12-year career as a creative director at Creative Spark, a major advertising agency. Her campaigns had won numerous awards, and she was a respected figure in the industry. "Judy, I've warmed up Harper's milk," Eric's voice called from the open kitchen connected to the living room. Eric was an up-and-coming architect who had recently gained attention for his sustainable, environmentally friendly home designs. The two had met 7 years ago when Eric participated as a consulting architect in an environmental protection campaign that Judith was working on. "Thank you," Judith smiled. "She's still sleeping." Unusually sound all through the morning. Eric gave her a warm smile and picked up his coffee cup. "Your mother's coming today, right?" Judith's expression clouded slightly. Her mother, Eleanor, was a former high school teacher who had been feared by her students as the Iron Lady. Her strict, uncompromising personality hadn't changed at home, and Judith spent her childhood constantly trying to meet her mother's high expectations. "Yes, she's coming at 11. She says it's for Harper's 5-month birthday." Eleanor had suddenly lost her husband to a heart attack 10 years ago, and since then, her dependence on and desire to control Judith had intensified. When Judith graduated from college, became independent, and rented her own apartment, Eleanor opposed it as wasteful. She wasn't pleased about Judith's marriage to Eric at first either, claiming that it would interfere with your career. After getting married, Judith consciously began to distance herself from her mother, limiting contact to weekly phone calls. However, Harper's birth changed everything. Eleanor became abnormally attached to her grandchild and started visiting almost every week. "Need any help?" Eric placed his hand on Judith's shoulder. "I'm fine. Mom said she'd bring a cake, so I'll just prepare some coffee." "Your mother has been coming over a lot lately," Eric said. "She seems to have changed since Harper was born." Judith answered with slight hesitation. "Yes, but I'm a bit worried about Mom lately. Every time she comes, she nitpicks about how I'm holding the baby wrong or how I should do this instead. Last week, she even canceled the babysitter while I was out and insisted on looking after Harper herself." Eric shrugged. "Maybe she just loves her granddaughter. She's her first grandchild, so she must be excited." "Maybe, but..." Judith trailed off. Eric probably couldn't fully understand her complicated relationship with her mother. He had grown up in a warm family, and his parents still respected his life choices. Judith heard Harper's soft fussing through the baby monitor. "Sounds like she's awake." She headed to the bedroom upstairs and entered the bright room with light blue wallpaper. In the crib, Harper was waving her tiny arms and legs. She had inherited her father's brown curly hair and big blue eyes, but her calm expression and intelligent gaze resembled Judith. "Good morning, my little treasure," Judith gently lifted the baby. Harper looked up at her mother's face and smiled, touching her cheek with her tiny hand. In that moment, all worries and anxieties seemed to disappear. Eric was standing at the door. "Watching you two makes me feel like the happiest person in the world." "We are happy," Judith smiled. "Whatever happens, I want to protect this happiness." The doorbell rang. "Mom seems to have come early," Judith said, holding Harper in her arms. "Eric, could you get the door?" When Eric opened the door, Eleanor Finch was standing there. Short, neatly arranged white hair, a pearl necklace, and a perfectly tailored navy suit. Her usual stern expression, but today she looked a bit different. There was a rare excitement on her face. "Good morning, Eric," Eleanor briefly greeted him and proceeded to the living room. When she spotted Judith and Harper, her expression softened unusually. "Oh, my adorable granddaughter. Are you happy to see Grandma?" Eleanor reached out for Harper and took her from Judith. Usually, she would criticize Judith for holding the baby incorrectly, but today, unusually, she said nothing. Instead, she pointed to a large box placed beside the sofa. "Today is a special day. I brought a present for Harper." Eleanor gently held Harper and showed her a large gift box. "Open it, Judith." Judith approached the box and untied the ribbon. Inside was a sleek black and silver stroller. A glossy aluminum frame, soft-looking black seat cover, and the latest suspension system. It was clearly a luxury item, probably costing 3 times the normal price. "Mom, this is..." Judith was at a loss for words. "It's a special order, top-of-the-line model," Eleanor explained proudly. "A custom model from a leading European manufacturer. It's worthy of my beloved granddaughter. But such an expensive item." Judith couldn't hide her bewilderment. Eleanor had always been someone who despised wastefulness. Judith remembered that even when she wanted a small toy as a child, she was admonished that extravagance is a sin. So why this sudden expensive present? "I'll do anything for my granddaughter," Eleanor smiled with unusual softness. Judith felt uncomfortable with that smile. How many years had it been since she'd seen her mother smile like this? Eric opened his eyes wide. "This is wonderful, Eleanor. It's the latest model, isn't it? You've changed," he winked at his wife. "Let me show you how to use it." Eleanor handed Harper to Eric and began to unfold the stroller. "This handle can be adjusted for height. And this is the special braking system." She explained the brake operation method with particular care. "Always use this on slopes. Safety first." While Judith had mixed feelings about her mother's enthusiasm, she expressed her gratitude. "Thank you, Mom. It's a lovely present." That afternoon, Eleanor left unusually early, and the rest of the day passed peacefully. Harper was in a good mood, and Judith and Eric tried out the new stroller around the house. The operation certainly seemed good, though the way to apply the brakes was a bit unique. "I might try going to the park with it tomorrow," Judith said. "Sounds good. But I have a meeting with a client tomorrow, so I can't join." "Take some pictures for me," Eric replied. The next morning, Judith put Harper in the new stroller and set out for their first walk. The spring sunshine was warm, and the neighborhood trees were covered with pale green leaves. The stroller indeed had a smooth ride, and Harper hardly seemed to feel the bumps on the usual uneven roads. However, as she continued walking, Judith noticed that the handle felt a bit stiff. It required more force than expected, especially when trying to turn. "Maybe it's just because it's new," she thought and continued her walk. About 15 minutes from her house, on the viewpoint atop a small hill, there was a beautiful view overlooking the entire town. There, Judith happened to meet an old friend, Kathy Adams, who lived in the neighborhood. "Judy. It's been a while." Kathy greeted her cheerfully. "So this is Harper I've been hearing about. She's absolutely adorable." The two sat on a bench at the viewpoint and chatted about raising children and local gossip. Kathy, a mother of 2, gave various pieces of advice as a parenting veteran. "That's a lovely stroller," Kathy remarked admiringly. "Is it new?" "Yes, my mother gave it to me yesterday." "Eleanor did?" Kathy seemed a bit surprised. It's unusual for her to give such a luxury item as a present. "Yes, I was surprised too. Come to think of it," Kathy casually mentioned, "I saw Eleanor at Davis Home Center last week. She was shopping in the tools section. Has she developed an interest in DIY?" Judith frowned. It was hard to imagine Eleanor being interested in DIY. She was the type who would say, "It's unladylike for women to handle tools," and leave all home repairs to professionals. "There must have been something special going on," Judith answered lightly, but something nagged at her. On her way home, Judith recalled Kathy's words. The fact that her mother had been shopping at a tool store and the sudden expensive gift. Could there be a connection? Such thoughts crossed her mind, but she told herself, I'm overthinking this. On her route home, there was a gentle slope leading to her house. Normally it wouldn't be noticeable, but today, pushing the stroller, she was more cautious than usual. As she reached the top of the slope, Judith checked the brakes. She operated the lever as Eleanor had explained, but something felt off. That's strange. And then, suddenly, something terrifying happened. The stroller's brakes stopped working. Despite her firmly gripping the handle, the stroller slipped out of her hands as if it were alive. The stroller began to speed down the slope. Judith's hands left the handle, and she lost her balance for a moment, coming to a stop. Harper, she screamed, immediately regaining her composure and starting to chase after it with all her might. The stroller accelerated as it continued down the slope. The four wheels rotated smoothly, and the stroller was heading straight toward the intersection at the bottom. Beyond that was a main road with frequent traffic. Someone stop it. Help! Judith shouted desperately as she ran downhill. She had never run this fast in her life. But she couldn't catch up with the stroller, which was aided by gravity. People walking on the slope looked at the situation with surprised faces, but the stroller passed by before they could react. Someone help! Judith's anguished cries echoed throughout the neighborhood. Her heart was pounding so hard it felt like it would burst out of her chest. The intersection was approaching. If it went past there, it was too terrifying to imagine. At that moment, a large man darted out from the sidewalk and began sprinting toward the stroller with all his might. He moved with astonishing speed, heading like a missile toward the stroller. The man caught up with the stroller just before it entered the intersection. He caught it, absorbing the impact with his body, and planted his feet firmly on the ground to gradually reduce its speed. His shoe soles left marks on the asphalt from the friction, and finally, the stroller came to a halt. Judith arrived at the scene, barely able to breathe. The man moved the stroller to a safe position and checked inside. It's okay, the baby is safe. Harper looked surprised but wasn't crying. With trembling hands, Judith picked up her daughter and held her tightly to her chest. Thank you so much, if you hadn't been there. I'm Trevor Washington, the man introduced himself. He was a large black man with an athletic build. Former NFL player. I react instinctively in situations like this. I'm Judith Harrison, she said tearfully. Thank you so much for saving my daughter. Trevor was limping slightly. I might have sprained my ankle, but it's nothing serious. I'm just glad your daughter is safe. People began to gather around, and someone had already called an ambulance and the police. Judith, holding Harper tightly, thanked Trevor repeatedly. Her mind was in confusion. Why had the brakes stopped working? How could this happen with a brand new stroller? At that moment, her smartphone rang. Looking at the screen, she saw it was a call from her mother. With trembling hands, she answered the phone, and Eleanor's voice came through. Judith? How was your walk? How's the stroller working? Mom. Judith was at a loss for words. There seemed to be something expectant in Eleanor's voice. I'll call you back later, she answered briefly and hung up. Amid the confusion and fear, one question arose in her mind. Was this really an accident? As the ambulance siren blared, Judith cradled Harper in her arms. Her whole body was still trembling, and she couldn't help but check and recheck that her daughter was unharmed. Paramedics were examining Trevor's ankle, and 2 police officers were recording the situation. We need to examine the stroller, said one of the officers, Detective Johnson, who seemed to be a veteran. To identify the cause of the accident. Judith agreed. Was this really just an accident? Detective Johnson furrowed his brow. What do you mean? Judith told him about the unnaturally timed call from her mother. She also mentioned that her mother had given her this stroller as a present the day before, and that a friend had spotted her mother at a tool store. It might just be a coincidence, but... She trailed off. It was unbelievable to suspect her own mother. "We'll investigate all possibilities," Detective Johnson replied with a serious expression. "We'll take this stroller as evidence." After the police car and ambulance left, Judith thanked Trevor again and exchanged contact information with him. "Thank you so much. If you hadn't been there..." "Don't worry about it," Trevor smiled kindly. "What matters is that your daughter is safe." When Judith returned home, Eric had rushed back from work. Seeing Judith and Harper, he hurried over and embraced them both. "What happened?" "I got a call from the police." Judith explained everything: how the stroller's brakes had suddenly failed, how Harper had careened toward the intersection, how former NFL player Trevor had saved her, and about the unnaturally timed call from her mother. "What does this mean?" Eric shouted, his face turning red. "Your mother, surely not." "I don't know," Judith shook her head. "But I'm scared, if Mom really did." "Who would do such a thing?" Eric was trembling with anger. "If Eleanor really did this, I'll never forgive her." Harper began to cry, and Judith, while comforting her daughter, said, "We don't know anything for certain yet. Let's wait for the police investigation." That night, Eleanor called several times, but Judith didn't answer, letting the calls go to voicemail. All the messages were similar, asking, "Are you okay? Did something happen? I'm worried." But there was a strange tension in each voicemail, giving the impression that Eleanor was hiding something. The next morning, Detective Johnson came to visit in person. His expression was sterner than yesterday, and he was holding a file. "Mrs. Harrison, I'm here to share our findings," he said as he sat in the living room. The stroller's braking system was clearly tampered with. According to expert analysis, it was a deliberate modification designed to look like a malfunction. Judith and Eric were speechless. Specifically, the brake wire was cut at a particular angle to ensure it would completely sever after a bit of use. This was not an accident but a planned act. "You mean, someone intentionally?" Judith said in a trembling voice. "Yes. Someone deliberately put Harper in danger," the detective said with a stern expression. "And after checking the security camera footage, we've confirmed that Eleanor Finch stopped by Davis Home Center before bringing the stroller home." The room fell silent. Judith felt her chest tightening. Eric clenched his fists, seemingly struggling to contain his anger. "However, we don't have definitive evidence yet," the detective continued. "We're applying for a warrant to search your mother's home, but in the meantime, please think if there's anything else that might be relevant." After the detective left, Judith and Eric sat in silence. As suspicions about her mother grew stronger, Judith's mind was in turmoil. Her past relationship with her mother, the sudden kindness, the unnatural phone call, it was all starting to connect. "Let's go to Eleanor's apartment," Eric said with determination. "We need to know the truth." They left Harper with a babysitter and headed to Eleanor's apartment. However, there was no response no matter how many times they knocked on the door. "Seems she's not home," Eric sighed. At that moment, a woman who appeared to be the apartment manager came out from the neighboring room. "Are you looking for someone?" "I'm looking for my mother, Eleanor Finch," Judith answered. "Oh, Mrs. Finch left in a hurry this morning. She said there was an emergency." Judith felt uneasy as she asked, "If possible, could you show us her room? It's a family emergency." The manager hesitated a bit but seemed moved by Judith's desperate expression. "If you're her daughter, just for a moment." Eleanor's apartment was as orderly as usual, but papers were scattered on the table. There were clearly receipts from a hardware store, cutouts from the stroller manual, and diagrams of the braking system. What caught their eye further was a small metal part that had fallen on the floor. It was clearly part of the stroller's brake. Unbelievable. Eric couldn't contain his anger. She really did it. While dazed, Judith opened a drawer of her mother's desk. There was a neatly bound diary. Normally, she would never read someone else's diary, but the situation was extraordinary. She opened the page with the most recent date. The words written there made Judith tremble uncontrollably. Judith is drifting away from me. That child is taking everything away. My daughter's affection belongs only to me. Since Harper's birth, Judith prioritizes that child over me. Phone calls have decreased, and visit times have shortened. At this rate, my existence will be erased. Turning more pages, even more disturbing content followed. If only Harper weren't there, everything would return to normal. Judith would come back to me. A mother's death hurts a daughter, but it heals with time. But my pain continues forever. Judith dropped the diary and collapsed to the floor. Eric supported her and embraced her. This is a nightmare, Judith said in a trembling voice. Mom really tried to. At that moment, they heard the apartment door open. When they turned around, Eleanor was standing there. Her face was momentarily filled with surprise, but quickly returned to a calm expression. What are you doing? Eleanor asked in a low voice. Her eyes were fixed on the diary that had fallen to the floor. Judith stood up. Why? How could you? What are you talking about? Eleanor said nonchalantly. Entering my room without permission, Judith, I don't remember raising you that way. Eric said in an anger-filled voice, that's enough. The evidence is right there. It's clear that you tampered with the stroller. Nonsense. Eleanor raised her voice. I would never do such a thing. Judith picked up the diary with trembling hands and showed her mother the open page. What is this? Mom, it's all written here. The color drained from Eleanor's face. That's just a fantasy. I wrote it on a bad day. Did the stroller brake wire also break due to fantasy? Eric pointed at the part that had fallen on the floor. Is the hardware store receipt also a coincidence? Eleanor was silent for a moment. Then suddenly, her expression changed. Her composure crumbled, and anger and hatred appeared on her face. Yes, it was me, she shouted. That child stole your love from me. Since she was born, you haven't paid any attention to me. While trembling at her mother's explosive emotions, Judith tried to respond calmly. Mom, I'm just living my own life. Harper is my child, your granddaughter. We're all family. Your life. Eleanor said mockingly. You are a part of me. I created you. I dedicated my entire life to you, and you neglect my affection and give everything to that baby? Unforgivable. There was a manic light in Eleanor's eyes. She went to the kitchen counter and took something out from a drawer. A moment later, Judith and Eric realized it was a knife. Please calm down, Eric said cautiously. He was slowly changing his position to stand between her and Judith. If only that child weren't there, everything would go back to normal, Eleanor said, gripping the knife. Judith would come back to me. Eric took his cell phone from his pocket and pressed the buttons behind his back to call 911. He nodded slightly, signaling Judith to buy time. Judith took a deep breath and faced her mother directly. Mom, this isn't a competition. Harper is my child. Just as you loved me, I love her. That's natural. No. Eleanor shouted. It's not the same as what I did for you. I sacrificed everything for you. Since your father died, you've been my everything. That doesn't mean I should belong only to you, Judith said quietly but firmly. Love isn't about possession. It's about sharing. Eleanor's hand began to tremble. Tears welled up in her eyes. But, you're drifting away from me. I'll be alone. That's not true, Judith stepped forward. I love you, Mom. But I also love Harper. They're not separate things. If you want to be part of our lives, you need to love and accept Harper. The strength began to leave Eleanor's hand, and the knife fell to the floor. Her body trembled, and she gradually collapsed. I just didn't want to lose you. She broke down crying. At that moment, the door opened, and police officers entered the room. They quickly assessed the situation, seeing the fallen knife and scattered evidence. Eleanor Finch, Detective Johnson, stepped forward. I'm arresting you on suspicion of attempted murder and child endangerment. Eleanor didn't resist, just stared ahead with empty eyes. She remained silent even as the police officer handcuffed her and read her rights. Judith felt like her heart was breaking with confusion and sadness. Watching her mother being taken away, she was assaulted by complex emotions: anger, sadness, the pain of betrayal, and, strangely, sympathy for her mother. Are you okay? Eric embraced her. No, Judith answered honestly. But someday, I'm sure I will be. The truth had come to light, but the scars wouldn't heal easily. Her mother had tried to kill her grandchild. It would take time to accept that reality. But now, the most important thing for Judith was protecting Harper's safety and her family's happiness. Standing in front of the heavy county courthouse building, Judith took a deep breath. The cold winter wind caressed her cheeks, as if urging her to prepare herself. It was the day of Eleanor's first trial. 3 weeks had passed since her mother was charged with attempted murder and child endangerment. During that time, Judith's life had completely changed. Reporters lurked around the house, and the neighbors' eyes were a mixture of sympathy and curiosity. But what was most painful was facing the reality that her own mother had tried to kill her child. Are you okay? Eric placed his hand on her shoulder. His eyes reflected deep concern. Yes, as much as I can be, Judith nodded slightly. Let's go. Inside the courthouse, there was a solemn atmosphere. Prosecutors and defense attorneys were organizing their documents, and a small number of people sat in the gallery. When Judith and Eric took their seats, they felt the gaze of strangers. The prosecutor wants to talk to us, Eric said in a low voice. Prosecutor Robert Clayton approached and gave them a slight nod. Mrs. Harrison, today the results of the psychiatric evaluation will be presented. Eleanor has been diagnosed with pathological attachment disorder and borderline personality disorder. What does that mean? Judith asked. The defense will plead not guilty by reason of mental illness, Clayton explained quietly. However, we will prove that she had the ability to distinguish right from wrong at the time of the act. Your testimony will be very important. When Eleanor was brought into the courtroom, Judith's heart raced. Her mother looked thinner and paler than before. Seeing her in an orange prison uniform with handcuffs was surreal. When their eyes met, complex emotions floated in her mother's gaze: hatred, love, sadness, regret. The trial began, and the prosecution made its opening statement. Prosecutor Clayton clearly explained the details of Eleanor's tampering with the stroller, the evidence of the crime, and the contents of the diary. The defendant deliberately attempted to kill her granddaughter. It was an act born of pathological attachment to her daughter and jealousy toward her granddaughter. The defense countered, my client suffers from severe mental illness and lacked the ability to understand and control her actions at the time. She is not a criminal who needs punishment, but a patient who needs treatment. Trevor was called as a witness. Despite limping slightly, he stood at the witness stand with a dignified attitude. What do you think would have happened if that stroller had passed through the intersection? The prosecutor asked. Trevor answered with a serious expression, if it had continued, it would have certainly resulted in a fatal accident. A large truck was about to pass through the intersection. The stroller, with its brakes failing and out of control, would have been directly hit by the truck. Tension ran through the courtroom. Judith clutched her handkerchief with trembling hands. Over the next few days, the trial continued. Judith also took the stand and detailed her relationship with her mother, the circumstances under which the stroller was given, and the events of the day of the incident. Her voice occasionally trembled, but she felt the importance of conveying the truth. "What kind of mother was Eleanor to you?" the defense attorney asked. Judith took a deep breath. "My mother was strict, with high expectations, and sometimes controlling. But I know she loved me. I just understand now that her way of loving wasn't healthy." As the trial continued, Judith began seeing a psychologist for support. Counselor Dr. Sharon Murphy, a warm and understanding woman, helped Judith face her own emotions. "I'm afraid I might unconsciously repeat my mother's patterns," Judith confided during one session. "Just being aware of that is already a big step," Dr. Murphy smiled. "We all carry patterns we learned from our parents. But by recognizing them and consciously choosing, we can change them." At home, Eric was supporting her with all his might, but he too was confused. "To be honest," he confided one night, "I don't know how to face Eleanor. She's your mother, but she's also the person who endangered Harper." "I don't know either," Judith answered honestly. "For now, we can only take it one day at a time." There was unexpected support as well. One day, Trevor visited Judith's house. The large man was carrying a bouquet of flowers and a stuffed animal as presents for Harper. "How are you doing?" he asked as he sat in the living room. "Getting better, little by little," Judith smiled. Actually, Trevor hesitated a bit and said, "I've experienced complicated family relationships too. My father was an alcoholic, and my mother was codependent. It took me years to escape that environment." His frank confession made Judith feel her heart opening. Trevor continued, "I learned that while you can't change the past, how you respond to it is up to you." Trevor's words resonated deeply with Judith. For the first time, she began to have the courage to express her emotions frankly. Anger, sadness, the pain of betrayal, she started to understand the importance of acknowledging and feeling these emotions. On the final day of the trial, Eleanor suddenly stood up and asked to speak. As the courtroom fell silent, she began to speak in a trembling voice. "I admit my guilt," Eleanor said. "I am ill. But that's no excuse. I tried to control my daughter because I loved her too much. My actions toward my granddaughter were wrong, unforgivable." Her confession caused a stir in the courtroom. Eleanor's attorney seemed surprised but quickly recovered and stated, "Given my client's condition, we request a reduced sentence on the condition of treatment." Finally, the judge asked Judith for a victim impact statement. She slowly stood up and took a deep breath. "I cannot hate my mother," Judith began quietly. "She raised me and loved me. But that love became distorted. I can't forgive her yet either. I love my mother, but I cannot forgive the act that endangered me and my daughter." She paused once and looked toward her mother. Eleanor had her head bowed and was crying. "I want my mother to receive appropriate treatment. And I hope that someday she will truly understand and heal." After considering all testimony and evidence, the judge delivered the sentence. Eleanor Finch is sentenced to mandatory treatment in a psychiatric facility and 5 years of actual imprisonment. At the verdict, the courtroom fell silent. Eleanor nodded slightly and looked at Judith one last time. In her eyes was regret and something else, perhaps a sense of release. Outside the courthouse, the winter sun was peeking through the clouds. Judith gripped Eric's hand tightly. "What now?" Eric asked gently. "Someday I might be able to forgive my mother, but now I want to focus on healing myself and my family," Judith said with determination. Trevor approached them. "That was tough," he said kindly. Without you, this day wouldn't have come, Judith thanked him sincerely. I'd like to continue to be there for you guys, Trevor smiled. If it's alright, could I come visit Harper sometimes as her honorary uncle? Judith and Eric agreed with smiles. In an unexpected way, their family had gained a new connection. The soft spring sunshine enveloped the entire park. Harper, now 2.5 years old, was chasing butterflies with her brown curly hair fluttering in the breeze. Harper, don't go too far. Judith called from the bench. Judith's family life was gradually returning to normal. Of course, they weren't completely free from past trauma, but they had succeeded in building a healthier family relationship. Judith had returned to the advertising agency 6 months ago and was now working part-time, finding a balance that allowed her to cherish time with her family. Eric's architectural firm was also doing well, having recently won an award for environmentally friendly home design. Uncle Trevor. Harper suddenly cried out happily and ran toward the park entrance. Trevor was standing there. He smiled and lifted Harper high. Hey, princess. You've grown. True to his promise, Trevor visited them regularly and had become a special presence as Harper's Uncle Trevor. Utilizing his experience as a former NFL player, he now ran a sports program for local boys and girls. What did you bring today? Harper asked with expectant eyes. Well, let's see, Trevor pulled a small paper airplane from his pocket. This can fly through the air. Harper let out a cry of joy. Watching Trevor and Harper play, Judith sat next to Eric. He's really a wonderful person, Judith smiled at her husband. Eric agreed. Life is strange. If that terrible event hadn't happened, we would never have met him. Judith looked a bit into the distance. I got another letter from Mom. Eleanor continued her treatment at the psychiatric facility in prison. At first, the content of her letters was confused and often tried to justify her actions. But recently, changes had been noticeable. According to the counselor's report, Eleanor was gradually beginning to recognize her behavioral patterns. Though still far from complete recovery, moments when she acknowledged her actions were wrong were increasing. What did she write? Eric asked quietly. This time, it was a bit different, Judith said. For the first time, Mom was truly apologizing. She wrote, I was only thinking of myself. I sincerely want to apologize for putting you and Harper in danger. Eric placed his hand on his wife's shoulder. That's a big step. According to the facility's psychologist, Eleanor had been justifying her actions to her cellmates, saying, I was trying to protect my daughter, but in a recent group therapy session, she had for the first time confessed, perhaps I was trying to protect myself. I'm not ready to meet her directly yet, Judith said quietly, but someday, maybe. Eric gently took her hand. There's no need to rush. Everything at your own pace. In the distance, Trevor was putting Harper on a swing. She looks really happy, Judith smiled. Thanks to you, Eric said. You're a wonderful mother. At those words, tears welled up in Judith's eyes. For a long time, she had been fighting the fear that she might become like her mother. But now, she was gradually overcoming that fear. Uncle Trevor, higher. Harper's voice could be heard. Trevor carefully pushed the swing, occasionally looking toward Judith and Eric with a smile. He too seemed to have found his place as a member of this family. As evening approached and the sky began to turn crimson, they left the park. Harper was perched on Trevor's shoulders, happily looking around. Judith and Eric held hands and followed. Back at home, Trevor was invited to dinner. Around the table, they laughed and shared memories. Even after Harper went to sleep, the adults continued their quiet conversation. Sometimes I think, Trevor said quietly, what if I hadn't been at that place that day? But you were, Judith said gently. That's what matters. As the night deepened and it was time for Trevor to leave, they exchanged goodbyes at the front door. "Next Saturday, my Little League team has a game," Trevor said. "If you'd like, bring Harper along." "We'll definitely come," Judith smiled. "Harper will be delighted." After Trevor left, Judith and Eric headed to their bedroom. In the moonlight streaming through the window, Judith peeked into Harper's room. The little girl was sleeping with a peaceful expression. "My relationship with my mother is complicated and may never completely heal," Judith whispered softly. "But I won't repeat my mother's mistakes. Love isn't about possession, but giving freedom. That's the most important thing I want to teach Harper." Eric embraced his wife. An unknown future stretched before them, but they no longer had anything to fear. Together, they had finally emerged from the shadows of the past and begun walking in the light.